The car door slammed like a verdict, sharp and final, swallowed instantly by the howling wind. And in that moment, Emily Carter realized something was terribly wrong, not just with the storm raging across the empty Colorado highway, but with the man she had trusted with her life, because Richard Vaughn didn't look back. Not once. Not even as she stood there 7 months pregnant. Her breath turning into thin white clouds in the freezing air, her coat too light for 20-degree weather, her hands trembling not from fear but from the sudden, quiet understanding that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision, calculated, deliberate, and cold, and the snow kept falling, soft at first, then heavier, blanketing the road in silence, erasing tire tracks, erasing footprints, as if the world itself was trying to pretend this moment never happened. And for a second, just a second, Emily thought maybe he would stop, maybe the red glow of the taillights would pause, flicker, return, but instead they faded into the distance, swallowed by the storm, leaving nothing but the sound of wind cutting through the open space and the slow, steady rhythm of her heartbeat, louder than everything else, louder than the storm, louder than the truth settling deep in her chest. And somewhere inside her, the baby moved, a small, fragile reminder that she wasn't alone, that this moment wasn't just about her anymore, and she wrapped her arms around her belly. Instinctively, as if that simple gesture could shield something so much bigger than herself. And that's when the question hit her, sharp and impossible to ignore. How did a marriage that once felt untouchable end here, on the side of a deserted road, with a billionaire driving away from his own future, because just 3 years ago, Emily Carter had everything people thought mattered: a beautiful home overlooking the city skyline, a husband whose name opened doors, whose presence commanded rooms, whose wealth made problems disappear before they could even begin. And yet, beneath the polished surface, beneath the charity galas and the carefully curated smiles, something had already begun to crack, quietly, almost invisibly, the kind of crack you only notice when it's too late to fix. And it started small: missed calls, late meetings, conversations that felt shorter, colder, like words had lost their meaning somewhere along the way. And then came the silence, not loud, not dramatic, just the absence of something that used to be there, something Emily couldn't quite name at first, until one night, standing alone in their kitchen, staring at a half-finished dinner growing cold on the counter, she realized the truth wasn't sudden at all. It had been building, piece by piece, decision by decision, and now, standing in the middle of a snowstorm miles from the nearest town, she could finally see it clearly, not as a moment of weakness, not as a mistake, but as a pattern, a path that led directly here, to this exact place, at this exact time. And the wind picked up again, stronger now, biting through her clothes, forcing her to take a step forward, then another, because standing still meant freezing, and freezing meant losing everything. And Emily Carter wasn't ready to lose anything else, not tonight, not like this. Emily kept moving because stopping was not an option, each step slow and uneven as the snow thickened beneath her shoes, the road stretching endlessly ahead like a question with no answer. And the wind carried a low, constant hum that seemed to press against her thoughts, forcing her to focus on one thing at a time. Breathe in, breathe out, step forward, protect the baby, repeat. And somewhere between the rhythm of her breathing and the sharp sting of cold air against her face, memories began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments, pieces of a life that now felt distant and unreal, like something she had watched happen to someone else. Because there had been a time when Richard Vaughn looked at her as if she mattered, as if she was the only person in the room, a time when his voice softened when he said her name, when his hand found hers without hesitation, when promises were not just words, but something she believed in completely. And that version of him had felt real, solid, dependable, the kind of man people trusted, the kind of man who built empires and never lost control. And that was exactly what made the change so difficult to see at first, because it did not arrive like a storm. It came quietly, disguised as ambition, as pressure, as responsibility, long hours at the office, meetings that ran late into the night, calls that could not be interrupted. And Emily told herself it was temporary, that success demanded sacrifice, that this was just a phase they would move through together. But then came the details that did not fit. The faint scent of a perfume she did not recognize lingering on his coat. The way he would glance at his phone and turn it away just slightly. The conversations that ended the moment she entered the room, and each time she noticed something, she pushed it aside, not because she did not see it, but because acknowledging it would mean facing something she was not ready to face. Until one evening changed everything. It was early fall. The air still warm, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls of their penthouse, and Emily had been waiting. Dinner set, candles lit, a small smile ready for when he walked through the door. But instead of the familiar sound of keys and footsteps, there was silence, long enough to make her check the time twice, long enough for doubt to creep in. And when her phone finally lit up, it was not a call. It was a message, short, distant, almost careless, saying he would not make it home, saying something came up, saying do not wait. And for the first time, those words did not feel temporary. They felt final, like a door closing somewhere she could not reach. And later that night, standing alone in a room that suddenly felt too large, too empty, Emily realized something had shifted, not just in him, but in everything around them. Because love does not disappear all at once. It fades, slowly, quietly, until one day you look around and realize it is gone. And now, with the storm pressing in from all sides and the road stretching into darkness, that realization felt heavier than the cold, heavier than the fear, but also clearer than it had ever been, because whatever had started back then had led directly here, to a moment where the truth could no longer be ignored. And as Emily tightened her arms around her belly, feeling the small movement inside her again, she understood something else just as clearly. This story was not ending here, not in the snow, not in silence, not the way he expected. The road curved slightly ahead, barely visible through the thick curtain of falling snow, and Emily followed it without thinking, her body moving on instinct while her mind struggled to catch up with everything that had already happened. Because there was still a part of her that expected this to stop, expected headlights to appear behind her, expected the sound of an engine returning, but the silence stretched on, unbroken, and that silence forced something else to surface, something she had been holding back even from herself. The moment she truly understood that Richard had not just walked away from their marriage, he had been preparing to erase it. And the realization did not come from one single memory, but from a pattern that now felt impossible to ignore, a pattern that had been forming long before tonight, hidden behind polished smiles and carefully chosen words, because after that first missed dinner, there had been more absences, more excuses, more distance, until even their shared space began to feel divided. His office door closed more often, his schedule suddenly private, his tone shifting from warm to measured, as if every conversation required calculation. And then came the names, subtle at first, mentioned in passing during business calls, a new partner, a rising figure in his company, someone he described as sharp, efficient, indispensable. And Emily remembered the first time she saw her in person, standing across the room at a charity event. Poised, confident, perfectly composed in a way that demanded attention without asking for it. Vanessa Blake. And the introduction had been brief, almost too brief, just enough to acknowledge, not enough to explain, and Emily had smiled, polite, composed, unaware that she was standing at the edge of something already in motion, because it was not one moment that changed everything. It was a series of small confirmations that slowly replaced doubt with certainty, a late-night message that appeared on his phone before disappearing just as quickly, a business trip that extended without warning, a conversation that stopped the second she entered the room, and each time, Richard had an explanation, always reasonable, always controlled, delivered with the same calm confidence that made people believe him without question. And for a while, Emily wanted to believe him too, because the alternative was too heavy, too disruptive, too final, until the night she stopped asking questions altogether, not because she found answers, but because she no longer needed them, because the truth had already settled in, quiet and undeniable, and standing now in the middle of a storm that showed no sign of slowing. That truth felt sharper than ever, cutting through every lingering doubt, every unfinished thought, every memory that tried to soften what had become clear. And yet, beneath the cold, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the steady weight of everything she had lost, something else began to rise. Something unfamiliar but steady. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of clarity that only comes when there is nothing left to misunderstand. And as Emily adjusted her grip around her belly, feeling the small, steady movement inside her once more, she took another step forward, then another, her pace slow but certain, because whatever Richard believed he had ended tonight, whatever he thought he had left behind in the snow, he was wrong. And that certainty, quiet but unshakable, was the first thing that truly belonged to her again. The snow had begun to change its rhythm, no longer falling in soft, patient layers but swirling in uneven bursts as if the storm itself was shifting its attention. And Emily Carter noticed it first not with her eyes, but with the way the wind suddenly pressed differently against her back, sharper, more directional, carrying with it a faint change in distance that suggested something ahead, something other than endless white emptiness. And for the first time since the car had disappeared into the storm, her steps slowed not from exhaustion but from focus, because there was a shape forming in the haze, indistinct at first, then gradually more defined, a faint structure breaking through the monochrome world, and her breath tightened as she realized it might be shelter, or at least something that was not open road and freezing air. And yet even as hope tried to rise, caution held it back, because nothing about this night had earned her trust, not the silence, not the storm, not even her own memories which seemed to shift under pressure like fragile glass. And she kept moving forward anyway, one careful step at a time, her hand never leaving her belly, feeling the steady reminder of life there grounding her more than anything else could. And as she drew closer, the shape resolved into an old roadside structure, half hidden by snowdrifts, its exterior worn by time and weather, a small rest-stop building that looked abandoned at first glance, but still held a faint glow from a single exterior light flickering above the entrance. And Emily stopped a few feet away, letting the wind push past her as she studied it, her mind running through possibilities faster than her body could react, because danger was no longer an abstract idea. It was something she had already experienced in its quietest form, and she understood now that the most dangerous moments were not the ones that announced themselves loudly, but the ones that felt ordinary until it was too late. And inside her, the baby moved again, stronger this time. And she closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself, not asking for certainty anymore, but for endurance. And that was when she thought of Richard again, not as the man who left, but as the man who made choices without looking back, choices that had led her here, to this frozen roadside with no witnesses and no guarantees. And yet the thought no longer carried the same weight it had earlier, because something inside her had already begun to separate his decisions from her survival, as if they belonged to different worlds entirely. And she opened her eyes, stepping closer to the door of the small building, noticing the faint outline of footprints leading inside, partially covered by fresh snow, suggesting someone had been here not long ago. And that detail alone changed everything, because isolation was one thing, but presence meant possibility. And Emily reached for the handle slowly, her fingers stiff from cold, pausing just long enough to listen, the wind pressing against the walls, the faint hum of distant highway traffic barely audible, and beneath it all, a stillness that felt almost suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And she realized in that moment that whatever waited on the other side of that door was not just about shelter, it was about the next step forward, the next decision, the next point in a story that had already moved beyond anything she could undo. And with that understanding settling quietly in her chest, she tightened her grip, not with fear, but with resolve shaped by everything she had already endured, and she pushed the door open. The door moved with a slow, protesting creak as Emily Carter pushed it open, and the first thing she felt was not warmth but stillness, a strange kind of stillness that belonged to spaces forgotten by time, where the air held a faint trace of old heating and distant electricity, but nothing alive enough to feel welcoming. And she stepped inside cautiously, letting the storm fall away behind her as the door closed with a heavy sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room. And for a moment she simply stood there, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior, where a single overhead light flickered above a row of vending machines and empty chairs bolted to the floor, and the space looked like a roadside rest stop that had not seen consistent visitors in years, yet not entirely abandoned. because there were signs of recent presence that did not match neglect. A half-empty paper cup on a counter, a faint imprint in the dust along one table, and the subtle warmth of a heater that had been running not long ago. And Emily felt her awareness sharpen instantly, because isolation outside had felt predictable, but presence inside introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty required decisions, and decisions required energy she was running low on. And she moved slowly forward, each step careful on the tiled floor, her hand still resting protectively over her belly, feeling the steady movement within that anchored her more than anything else in the world. And as she reached the center of the room, she paused again, listening, because the building was not empty in the way abandoned places were empty. It was empty in the way something recently vacated might be, as if life had only just stepped out of sight. And she turned her head slightly, scanning the space, noticing a door behind the counter marked employees only, slightly ajar. And that small detail made her hesitate, because it suggested intention, not accident. And she exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think clearly despite the cold still clinging to her clothes and skin. And she reminded herself that fear without direction was useless, but observation was not. So she focused on what she could confirm. The temperature inside was warmer than outside by at least a noticeable margin, enough to matter, enough to sustain, and the flickering light above suggested unstable power rather than none at all. And then she heard it, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the hum of electricity, a sound like movement behind the walls, not hurried, not threatening, but deliberate enough to register. And her body responded before her thoughts fully formed, instinct tightening her posture as she shifted slightly toward the counter, not hiding, but positioning herself where she could see more than one angle at once. And in that moment she thought again of Richard Vaughn, not with anger, not with sorrow, but with a kind of distant clarity, as if his choices belonged to a different version of her life that no longer dictated what happened next. Because whatever this place was, whatever presence she had sensed, it was separate from him now, separate from the road, separate from the storm. And Emily Carter understood something quietly, but firmly as she stood in that dim roadside room. That survival was no longer about where she had been left, it was about what she chose to walk into next. And she took a slow breath, steadying herself, waiting, not frozen, not afraid in the way she had been before, but ready to respond. Emily remained still for a moment, longer than necessary, her breath slow and controlled as she tried to separate instinct from imagination, because the sound she had heard did not repeat itself, and silence returned to the small roadside rest stop like a heavy curtain dropping into place. But silence no longer meant safety, not after everything that had already happened, and she shifted her weight slightly, careful not to make unnecessary noise, her eyes adjusting fully now to the dim interior, where the flickering overhead light revealed more details she had not noticed before. A faint trail of wet footprints crossing the tiled floor near the counter, partially melted snow mixed with dirt, leading toward the employees' only door. And that detail changed everything, because it confirmed presence, recent and deliberate. And Emily felt her mind sharpen further, not with panic, but with focus, because uncertainty had always been the most dangerous condition. And now she had something real to evaluate, and she moved slowly toward the counter, keeping her movements steady and intentional, her hand never leaving her abdomen, feeling the small, consistent movements within that reminded her she could not afford hesitation. And as she approached the counter, she noticed a faint warmth radiating from behind it, likely from a vent or heater still active somewhere deeper in the building. And that meant power was not fully compromised, which meant systems were still running, which meant someone had access. And she exhaled quietly, steadying herself again as she scanned for anything useful, anything that could help her understand where she was and who might be here. And that was when she saw the second detail that shifted her understanding further. A small radio sitting near the register, its indicator light blinking softly, suggesting it had been used recently, not long ago. And the realization settled in her chest with quiet weight, because this was not abandonment. This was pause, temporary absence. And she had walked directly into the middle of it without knowing. And she paused again, listening more carefully now, letting the building reveal itself through sound, the faint electrical hum, the subtle creak of settling materials. And underneath it all, a distant sound like movement in another room, not rushed, not aggressive, but purposeful, and Emily's posture adjusted instinctively, not defensive but aware, as she shifted slightly to maintain a clear view of both the counter entrance and the hallway beyond, because now the environment had changed from unknown emptiness to structured uncertainty, and structured uncertainty could be understood, and as she stood there, she found her thoughts returning briefly to Richard Vaughn, not with emotion but with clarity, because whatever had happened on that road no longer defined her current reality. It was something she had passed through, not something she was still inside, and she realized that with surprising calm, because survival had narrowed her world down to immediate truth. What was in front of her, what was real, what required attention. And in that quiet rest stop with flickering light and unseen movement, Emily Carter understood that she was no longer waiting for anything to change her situation. She was already inside the moment where change had to begin, and she steadied her breathing, keeping her focus forward, prepared for whatever came next. Emily stayed aligned with the counter, not hiding but not exposing herself either, keeping her body positioned in a way that allowed awareness of every possible angle in the small rest stop. And as she did, the faint sound she had noticed before grew slightly clearer, not louder, but more distinct, like movement shifting from one space to another behind thin walls, and she realized it was not random noise but controlled activity, the kind that came from someone who knew the building, and that understanding tightened her focus even further, because now the environment was no longer abstract, it was structured, and structure meant patterns, and patterns could be anticipated, and she slowly let her breathing match that idea, steady, even, intentional, while her eyes tracked the edges of the room again, noticing how the flickering light above the vending machines cast uneven shadows across the floor, making the space feel larger than it actually was, and she adjusted her stance slightly, shifting her weight to maintain balance without drawing attention to herself. And then she heard it again, this time closer, a soft door click from somewhere behind the employees' only entrance, followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to create tension without breaking silence. And Emily did not move immediately, because movement without information was risk, and she had already learned enough tonight to understand that reacting too quickly was the same as losing control. So she waited, letting the sound settle into her awareness, and slowly a second sound followed, footsteps, measured and unhurried, approaching but not rushing, and she felt her heart rate increase slightly, but kept her breathing steady, anchoring herself in physical awareness rather than fear. And as the footsteps neared, a shape finally appeared in the doorway behind the counter, partially obscured at first, then fully visible as a man in his late 30s stepped into the light. Wearing a dark jacket dusted with snow, his expression neutral but alert, as if he had already assessed the room before fully entering it. And for a brief moment both of them paused, neither speaking, both evaluating, and Emily's mind processed details instantly. His posture suggested familiarity with the space. His movements suggested confidence rather than confusion. And the way his eyes moved across the room indicated he was not surprised to see someone there, which meant he had expected this possibility. And that realization made her even more cautious, because expectation implied awareness, and awareness implied control, and control was something she could not afford to surrender again. And he finally spoke, his voice calm but direct, asking a simple question about whether she had come in from the storm, and Emily chose her response carefully, not revealing more than necessary. Because trust was not something granted in situations like this, it was something earned slowly, and even then never completely. And as she answered in a steady voice, she kept her attention divided, part on him, part on the exits, part on the subtle details of the room, because survival now depended on observation more than reaction. And the man nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her answer, without fully committing to it. And then he gestured toward the back room, explaining that there was heat and supplies if she needed them. And Emily felt the weight of decision press quietly into the moment, because accepting help meant entering deeper into unknown space. But refusing it meant staying exposed in a structure she did not fully understand. And outside, the storm continued to press against the building like a living force, and she understood with quiet certainty that whatever direction she chose next would define what came after this moment. And she took a slow breath, steadying herself again, listening not just to his words, but to everything unspoken between them, before making the decision to move forward, not blindly, not safely, but deliberately. Emily followed the man's gesture without committing too quickly, because every instinct she had developed over the past hours told her that movement inside unfamiliar spaces carried consequences that were not immediately visible, and she kept her pace measured as she crossed the small distance from the counter toward the back of the rest stop, her eyes adjusting to the dim hallway beyond the employees' only door, where the lighting was steadier and warmer, casting a faint yellow glow across walls that were older than they appeared from the outside, and the air shifted subtly as she moved deeper, no longer carrying the bite of the storm, but instead holding a quiet, recycled warmth that suggested an old heating system still functioning beneath the surface. And she noted every detail as she walked: the placement of utility signs, the faint hum of electrical wiring, the worn edges of the floor tiles that indicated years of use rather than abandonment. And the man walked a few steps ahead of her without turning fully back, maintaining a respectful distance that did not feel invasive but also did not feel entirely casual. And that balance made her even more aware, because neutrality in moments like this was rarely accidental. And they reached a small corridor that opened into what looked like a break room, modest but functional, with a table, a few chairs, and a wall-mounted heater that was actively running. And the man finally stopped there, turning slightly to face her, as if giving her the option to choose her position within the space. And Emily paused at the threshold, letting her eyes scan the room fully before stepping inside, because entering a contained environment always required confirmation of exits, and she counted them quietly. One visible doorway leading further into the building, one back toward the main area, and a small side door that likely led outside, partially obscured by storage shelves. And only after mapping that did she allow herself to step in fully. And the man spoke again, explaining in calm, practical language that the rest stop was usually empty during this stretch of the night, that storms like this tended to isolate travelers until morning, and that he had been checking the building periodically because of the weather alert. And Emily listened without interrupting, absorbing tone as much as content, because people revealed more through pacing and certainty than through words alone. And his voice carried neither urgency nor pressure, which she noted carefully, and she responded only when necessary, confirming she needed warmth for a short time, nothing more, and he nodded once, moving toward a small cabinet where he retrieved a blanket and placed it on the table without approaching her directly. And that restraint mattered to her more than anything else he had said, because it indicated awareness of boundaries. And she took the blanket after a brief pause, wrapping it around her shoulders slowly, feeling the gradual return of warmth against her skin. And for the first time since she had been left on the roadside, her breathing began to stabilize, not because the danger had disappeared, but because her immediate survival needs were no longer pressing with the same intensity. And she allowed herself to sit at the edge of one of the chairs, still positioned so she could see both the hallway and the exit without turning her head fully. And the man leaned slightly against the opposite wall, maintaining distance, and asked no intrusive questions, only confirming whether she had contact with anyone or a way forward once the storm passed. And Emily considered the question carefully before answering that she had no immediate contact and was waiting for conditions to clear, which was technically true. And as she spoke, she felt the weight of everything that had led her here settle into a quieter form, no longer chaotic but present, like something she could hold at a distance instead of being consumed by it. And outside, the storm continued, its slow, relentless movement across the highway. But inside the small rest stop room, time felt briefly suspended, giving her something she had not had since the car disappeared into the snow, a moment to think before the next decision. The quiet inside the small rest stop room felt temporary, like a pause between storms rather than an end to anything. And Emily Carter understood that deeply as she sat with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her posture still controlled, her awareness still active, because safety was never a state she could fully relax into anymore, only a condition she could manage moment by moment. And across the room the man remained where he had positioned himself earlier, not closer, not intrusive, simply present in a way that allowed space without creating isolation. And that balance kept her attention anchored, because trust in situations like this was never absolute. It was always partial, always conditional, and she observed him quietly as he checked something on a small wall panel. Likely a weather update or system control, his movements unhurried, deliberate, and after a few seconds he spoke again, confirming that the storm outside was expected to continue for several hours, possibly longer, with visibility still near zero on the highway, and Emily absorbed that information without reacting outwardly. But internally, she recalibrated her timeline, because waiting was no longer passive. It was strategic, and time itself had become a variable she needed to measure carefully. And she shifted slightly in the chair, adjusting her position so she could still see both exits without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing so. And for the first time since entering the building, her breathing had stabilized enough for her to think beyond immediate survival. And that is when her thoughts returned again to Richard Vaughn, not as an emotional wound, but as a structural reality in her life that had now been removed from its original context. Because what he had done earlier on the road no longer defined her trajectory. It only defined the path that had brought her here. And she realized something quietly but firmly, that dependency had been replaced by separation in a way that could not be reversed. And that separation, though painful, also created space. And in that space, she began to reassess everything she thought she knew about control, choice, and consequence. Because none of those things had been in her hands earlier, but they were now, even if only in small increments. And the man across the room moved slightly, placing a bottle of water on the table within reach without breaking her focus. And that small action carried more meaning than words, because it acknowledged need without assumption. And Emily accepted it after a brief pause, not as trust, but as practicality. And as she drank slowly, she became more aware of her own condition, the fatigue in her body, the strain she had been ignoring, the steady presence of life within her that continued regardless of external circumstances. And that awareness grounded her further, because it reminded her that her decisions were no longer abstract. They had immediate and irreversible consequences. And she looked briefly toward the window at the far end of the room, where snow pressed against the glass in dense waves, erasing the outside world completely. And she understood then that waiting for the storm to pass was not about weather. It was about timing her next move with precision, because once she stepped back into that world, nothing would remain the same as it had been before. And the man finally spoke again, offering that when conditions improved, he could contact local assistance or help arrange transport toward the nearest town. And Emily considered that carefully, weighing not just the offer itself but what it implied, because accepting help meant allowing direction from someone else, while declining meant retaining full control over an uncertain path. And she realized that both options carried risk, just different kinds. And she lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission but in thought. And when she finally responded, her voice was steady, measured, and clear, stating only that she would decide when the time came. And the man nodded once without argument, respecting that boundary immediately. And in that quiet exchange, something subtle shifted. Not trust, not alliance, but recognition that she was not someone who could be easily directed or dismissed. And outside, the storm continued its slow movement across the landscape. But inside the small rest stop, Emily Carter sat in stillness that was no longer helpless, but deliberate, because for the first time since everything had begun, she was not being carried by events. She was beginning to choose how to move through them.